Unlike the two great Meiji Wars, the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, this time the enemies were not foreigners, and the unrest did not arise from territorial disputes. Instead, this 1911 conflict was an internal war between scholars and the state, a war on textual representations of 14th century Japanese history. Although the lives were actually lost in this textbook war, the stakes were high, because the scholars who waged this war were challenging the authenticity of the most essential aspect of Japan's imperial identity. This 1911 conflict revealed to us the role of history in 20th century Japan. History was not merely taught to us in the past, but was taught to support the greater enterprises of the state. So how did history become a state affair in Japan? The answer lies in the Japanese state deliberate pursuit of a national identity ever since the Meiji Restoration of 1868. History was used to convince the contemporary audience of the national identity's continuity and legitimacy. Moreover, the Meiji Constitution of 1889 placed sovereignty in the emperor and labeled the emperor as, quote, sacred and inviolable. The emperor derived his status and power from a series of ancient myths about the origins of Japan and a broken imperial line that can be traced to the sun goddess. Because the legitimacy of the emperor and hence the state rested upon a particular version of history, debates over history could not be confined to scholars. Interested in Japan's imperial identity, this summer I traveled to Japan to visit two archives, Tosho Bunko and Kyoku Toshokan. In these two archives, I read through several Japanese history textbooks published between 1900 and 1926. I was guided by two main research questions: the role history played in the formation of Japan's imperial identity, and the changes in the expression of that identity. I focused primarily on elementary school textbooks because they're one of the key mediums utilized by the state to promote imperial ideology. In 1903, the Ministry of Education issued an ordinance declaring that only textbooks designated by the state could be used in elementary schools. And for subjects, ethics, language, geography, and history, state was authorized to replace private publishers as authors of elementary school textbooks. From that point on, textbooks became ambassadors of state-approved messages. In the state textbooks I've examined, the Japanese nation is defined by kokutai, the unbroken ancestral tradition of imperial house. The word kokutai is often being translated into national polity or national body because the first word koku means country or nation, and the second word taikara means body. But I personally think the phrase national essence captures the meaning of kokutai more accurately, but because there's no perfect English translation for it, I will just refer to it as kokutai. The word and the concept of kokutai is not a product of the Meiji period. It had enjoyed a more or less continuous tradition of over 1,000 years prior to the Meiji Restoration. Nonetheless, as historian Carol Gluck writes, while in the 1880s, the Japanese considered kokutai as almost a synonym for a national organization, by the late 1890s, discussions on kokutai began to focus on its immutability and distinctiveness, and the myth of an unbroken imperial line that can be traced to the sun goddess became the core of kokutai. It is therefore unsurprising that all the Japanese history textbooks that I have read open with a chapter on the sun goddess. The 1903 Japanese history textbook, the first edition of state textbooks, set the precedent for all later state textbooks by opening with the line, Amaterasu is our emperor's ancestor, Amaterasu being the name of the Japanese sun goddess. Similarly, a 1910 teacher's manual, issued by the Ministry of Education, states that the chapter on Amaterasu, on the sun goddess, should celebrate the greatness of Amaterasu, clarify the honorable lineage of our imperial house, and explain the origins of our kokutai, which is unparalleled in this world. That history was taught to foster reverence for kokutai was not secret. All teachers' manuals published by the Ministry of Education, in its introduction, the third article states that Japanese history is not taught for children to merely memorize facts. It is expected that, through history, students will understand kokutai and foster principles that are necessary to become the country's people. Statements such as this evoke an image of the state consciously, if not forcibly, using history to articulate national identity. Historian Irokawa Daikichi had argued that the Japanese imperial identity reached its final form by 1912, the year of the Meiji Emperor's death, and the state was so successful at promoting it that it prevented any opportunity with descent until 1945, the end of World War II. However, the state textbooks that I have read do not portray an image of the state aggressively endorsing a well-defined doctrine. Instead, what I found was a very slow awakening of a national identity that only became clarified as the state reacted to public sentiments and crises. The state history textbook certainly aimed to champion Koktai, but this was not obvious in the first edition of the textbook. In the 1903 textbook, the first edition of state textbooks, the word Koktai only appears once in a chapter on Sono Joli, a political slogan of the 1850s and 1860s that aimed to rever the emperor and expel the barbarians. Even in the opening chapter on the sun goddess, the authors did not employ the word Koktai, which is significant considering that the claim to divine imperial ancestry is Koktai. However, by 1920, when the state issued its third edition, the word Koktai infiltrated almost every chapter. For example, whereas the first two editions of state textbooks, 1903 and 1909, describe the connection to the sun goddess as the foundation of the Japanese empire, the 1920 edition proclaims it as the foundation of Koktai. The authors of the 1920 edition even managed to incorporate the word Koktai in chapters that were not related to Koktai. For example, the story of Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun of the Ashikaga shogunate, accepting the title King of Japan from the main dynasty emperor of China, is condemned in the 1920 edition as an act of neglected Koktai because our country does not have a king aside from the emperor. This statement is notably absent in the first two editions of state textbooks. Because the earlier textbook's discourse on national identity lacks clarity and force, it can be argued that even by the late Meiji period and even by the 1910s, the state had not formulated a concrete ideology and was just struggling with the definition and usage of Koktai. The contradictions embedded in the portrayal of national identity in elementary school textbooks were made blatantly obvious in the textbook of 1911. When the newspaper reported that the 1903 and 1909 state textbooks titled a chapter of 14th century Japanese history as Nambokucho, Southern Northern Courts, there was an uproar. Contemporary educators at the term argue that the term Nambokucho, Southern Northern Courts, implies that there has been a period of time in Japanese history when two equal legitimate imperial courts existed simultaneously, which is unacceptable because the 1889 Meiji Constitution proclaims imperial sovereignty as absolute and indivisible. After much debate, the government acknowledged the Southern Court as fully legitimate, overriding arguments from scholars who argued that both courts were equally legitimate. So in December of 1911, the state distributed a teacher's manual, which I managed to find in the archives. While the imperial timeline, including the 1909 and 1903 state textbooks, actually splits into two when discussing the Southern and Northern Courts, with the Emperors of the Southern Courts on top and the Emperors of the Northern Courts at the bottom, the timeline, including the 1911 manual and all textbooks after, is actually uniform because it only includes the names of the Southern emperors. The Northern emperors, not these students, or were not discussed in the timeline. And in 1912, the state actually issued a revised edition of the textbook, changing the title from Southern Northern Courts to Period of the Yoshino Court. Yoshino Court is the name of the Southern Court. For the authors of state textbooks to be unaware that the phrase Southern Northern Courts contributes one of the most fundamental aspects of Koktai, that there is only one imperial line, implies that even members within the Ministry of Education, within the government, were unsure of how to represent the national identity they were trying to disseminate. Notably, the non-government textbooks published in the 1899 to 1903 actually do not use the phrase Southern Northern Courts. Instead, the scholars use names of famous people from the Southern Court as its chapter titles. This avoided the dilemma of undermining Koktai, and more importantly, it adhered to a trend of history writing in Japan, which tended to favor the Southern Court because its supporters were seen as the epitome of devotion to the emperor. The first two editions, 1903 and 1909, are therefore anomalies. These two editions are actually anomalous in various other aspects as well. For example, amongst various other things, unlike the private textbooks published in 1903, these first two editions of state textbooks do not describe the warrior rule as unfortunate or regrettable, do not mourn the death of warriors who fought for the imperial court in the Tokugawa period, and do not praise Tokugawa Mitsukuni, a powerful lord of the early Edo period celebrated for respect for the imperial court. The 1920 edition actually dedicated an entire chapter to Tokugawa Mitsukuni, but his name did not appear in the 1903 or 1919 edition. By removing these themes, which are all reused in the 1920 edition, the first two editions of state textbooks fail to echo a level of clarity and nationalistic intensity that existed in private textbooks published in 1903, before textbooks were nationalized. This may suggest that the state textbooks did not create a nationalistic rhetoric, but was following public discourse.
the state was not the one who engineered an all-encompassing doctrine. It may have been recirculating previously existing ideas and developing them slowly. Also key to the formation of Japan's national identity is Japan's regional identity, depiction of Japan's relations with the East and with the West. In both state and non-state textbooks, tones of pan-Asianism are stronger than the desire to be in solidarity with the West. All of Japan's actions were attributed to its desire to benefit East Asia. For example, Japan declared war against Germany to protect the peace of East Asia. Japan allied with England to protect the peace of East Asia. And Japan annexed Korea to maintain forever the peace of East Asia. Nevertheless, the authors also stressed that Japan was not merely a member of East Asia. It was above East Asia. For example, when discussing the Meiji Constitution, both the 1903 and 1909 state textbooks emphasized Japan was the only constitutional country of East Asia. And a middle school Japanese history textbook written by scholars run in the States actually proclaims that it was Japan's historic responsibility to guide other East Asian countries because they had the ability to blend Western and Eastern civilizations to create new civilization, and because it was the only constitutional country of East Asia. Japan was portrayed as superior to East Asia and has the rightful leader and protector of East Asia. As the research remains a work in progress, I still have a lot of questions I need to address. My thesis, which I'll write next semester, will investigate why the developed and fully doctrine of Kokutai did not emerge until after World War I, and why the state became so sensitive after World War I. But despite the various areas soon to be explored, I hope this was interesting, and thank you all for listening.